Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Togainu no Chi. Last time I left you off while we were still in the bar, but then something happened with the saves in this game and I don't know what the hell it was, but they all look like out of order and I couldn't find my place. I swear to God there's something haunted about this game because it really did F up my saves. But anyway, so I had to sort of find my place again. So here the log is up. Let's see, the last line we read together was, he walked into the crowd laughing until his tall shape vanished from sight. So then, at some point, the music had changed to a breezier, lighter tune. One elbow perched on the table, Rin shifted his gaze back to Igura and Keisuke. And I'll just go ahead and play these voice lines, I guess. Well, this time I'll consider doing it with my headphones in so you guys can hear anything at all.
あんな感じのうさんくさいおっさんだけど悪いやつじゃないからさ。確かにうさんくさくはあったかな。ここじゃね、人を信じる気持ちは 70% ぐらいにしといた方がいいよ。平気な顔で嘘つく悪党とかゴロゴロいるからさ。そんなのここじゃなくてもどこでもいい。Continue with your line. He couldn't be more right, which is exactly why Igura remained suspicious of him. They made small talk for a while afterwards and went their separate ways. Since nobody had cell phones in Toshima, getting in touch with someone involved leaving messages at common hangouts, or else planning a meeting in advance. Why can't they get a cell phone? So, okay. Igura didn't trust Rin completely, as Rin himself had said. Here it was safer to doubt everyone. Which was why, though he'd mentioned where they'd planned on going next, he thought it better to make their way through the city without Rin. Tomorrow they would head back to Arbitro's place so Keisuke could join Igura. For tonight they decided to stay in the coffee shop on the main street. Ever since speaking to Motomi, Keisuke had been brooding. He obviously had a lot on his mind and Igura felt no need to break the silence. Fear, desperation, confusion, resolve. Igura could only guess at what he must be feeling. After that, neither spoke, and thus their second night in Toshima passed. Alright. He heard a voice. Calling him? He couldn't say for sure. He didn't know whose voice it was, or if it was a voice at all. Perhaps it was merely a breath of wind. His chest ached. He couldn't see. He was adrift in a sea of emotion. What? When he tried to think, his thoughts burst into static. It was like peering through the keyhole of a door shut against him. He could glimpse only the tiniest fragment. Back then. If only. Back then? Back when? He didn't know. Does he have some kind of stupid, repressed childhood memories? Because I'm not about that. But the ache in his chest would not go away. Igura woke to light streaming in through the doorless entrance. It felt like he'd been dreaming. Well, yeah. It was probably the usual dream. Sometimes upon waking he would be seized by a peculiar sense of deja vu. He never remembered what it was about, but he was sure he'd seen the same dream countless times. He'd never given it much thought though. It didn't really bother him. Well, it seems like he's giving it a lot of thought right now, but fine. He turned to check on Keisuke, who was leaning against the wall, gazing absently at the entrance. His little smile was tinged with exhaustion, but he seemed calm, especially considering how anxious he had looked the day before. Only then did Igura realize that he hadn't eaten a bite since yesterday. His nerves must have made him forget his appetite. Even now he wasn't especially eager to eat, but he decided he'd better put something in his stomach. He removed the food from his bag and passed half of it to Keisuke. Delighted, Keisuke picked up a 10-centimeter long dark lump of solid matter. What? Excuse me? These solids were dry foods that had been developed in the famine years after the war. They were essentially an improved version of the nutritional supplements that people had used in the past. They required no preparation and came in a variety of flavors. In addition to being nutritious, they encouraged leptin secretion, which stimulated the satiety of the center of the brain.
They were cheap, healthy, and filling. It was no wonder they'd grown so popular. Even if they didn't taste quite the same as real food.
アキラはどれにするの？
なんでもいい。
でもさ、いつもオムライス味食べてない？
たまたまだろ。
Akira really couldn't care less when it came to solid flavors. But it was true that he developed something of a taste for omelet rice. If one was available, he'd usually take it. For some reason, though, he found it embarrassing to have that pointed out. He chewed away in sullen silence. God, Akira's annoying. He's too embarrassed to admit that he likes a flavor?
もう結構長い付き合いなのに、俺、アキラの好みとか趣味ってあんまり知らなかったりするんだよな。
God, he's so emo.
なん
Oops.
か新しい発見って感じだった。
I don't know the button to make the dialogue get hidden. There. See, I always forget in these stupid Japanese VNs. Alright.
他人の好みとかどうでもいいだろ。
そうでもないよ。
He's so emo. It's like, ugh. It really does have that early 2000s energy. He is like literally an emo kid, and I hate it. As Akira concentrated on finishing the solid as fast as possible, he realized that Keisuke had stopped eating. He looked up. Keisuke was watching, his eyes soft.
なんだよ。
いや、なんでも。
Keisuke smiled, then bit back into a solid. For some reason, he seemed happy. They finished up their simple meal and headed to the palace in the early afternoon. Akira checked his phone just in case, but there was no sign that Emma had tried to contact him. Going from memory, they walked down the same alleys that Rin had led them through yesterday. In the red light district, the corpse of the man killed by the executioners was gone, with only dry bloodstains still clinging to the asphalt. They noticed a small crowd forming in front of the palace. Men with bloodshot eyes pumped their arms, jeering. A brawl was taking place at the center of the crowd. Though, through a gap in the jostling throng, Akira caught a glimpse of blood spraying into the air. At the same time, the sound of tearing flesh reached his ears. I mean, how loud could tearing flesh be? Right? It can't be that loud. The crowd roared. Seems like it'd be a very quiet thing. Fists clashed with fists, vying for dominance. The stronger smashed the weaker aside, continuing inexorably to its target, the enemy's nose. A dull crack rang out as bone and cartilage flattened beneath the blow. The man's knees buckled, and convulsing wildly, he pitched forward onto his face. Both fingers were drenched in blood. What Akira and Keisuke had witnessed was the decisive moment when two men had flung their blades into the pavement and wagered it all on the power of their fists. Spectators were going wild. Their eyes blazed with an unnatural heat. If this were Blaster, this was where it would end. Victory belonged to the last man standing. But Igura was different. Igura is so different, your back has to touch the ground. What? It's barely any different. The standing man picked up his knife and licked the blood off its blade. The fallen man was on his stomach, unconscious, as far as Akira could tell. But until his back had touched the ground, the fight wasn't over. The man who had all but won raised one heavy booted heel, then brought it down hard in the fallen man's skull, again and again. A horrible sound filled Akira's ear, like someone taking a bat to a melon. As howls of approval went up from the audience, Keisuke looked away. Finally, the man kicked his enemy's lifeless body, flipping it onto its back, and tore the tags from the loser's chest. The tags... God, he has a thin arm. The tags glistened red in the sunlight. He raised them high, a proud hero displaying the head of a vanquished beast. I'm surprised you were able to do anything with those fists. Damn, those are some stick arms. Triumph alone could not explain the glazed bloodshot look in his eyes. Those were the eyes of a man on rain. Oh no, he's a druggie. Drugs like that lifted you into another world, a world empty of fear and consciousness, of everything but joy and pleasure. A world where stomping a man's head to a pulp came as easy as breathing. Akira had envisioned Igura as a battlefield where one had to fend off constant attack, but now he was beginning to realize the truth. Igura was not a war but a hunt, where predators lay in wait for their prey to sate their hunger. And once the battle started, the hunt became a duel. So it is just a battle or war? Well, whatever. There was no stopping until one or the other had been reduced to a smear on the pavement. The ritual was sacred here. The smell of blood filled the air around them, enough to numb his brain. Okay. Akira's kind of a pussy.
Yo!
He kind of talks big, but he's actually a big pussy. As they passed the fountain heading towards the stairs, a voice called out to them.
Oh.
They turned to see Motomi, the information broker they'd met at the club yesterday. Akira thought that maybe the darkness of the club was what had made him seem so scruffy and worn. But the light of day only confirmed Akira's initial assessment.
Motomi-san, だっけ?
Keisuke, who had been pale since witnessing that gory match, smiled in relief, a familiar face.
イグラに参加するってんなら今日は多分ここに来るだろうと思ってな。用事のついでに立ち寄ったんだが、ナイスタイミングだったな。
Motomi's grin widened. He hadn't removed his cigarette.
ずいぶんヘビースモーカーだな、あんた。
Akira cast a look at Motomi's feet, where at least half a dozen cigarette stubs were scattered on the ground. Far too many for Akira to believe that this meeting was anything but planned.
まあな。
Motomi shrugged, letting Akira's tone slide off him like water.
これから中に入るんだろ。俺もついてっていいか？
何か用があるのか？
あの悪趣味っぷりを久々に拝みたくってな。
Indeed, the palace's decor was impossible to forget. But Akira couldn't shake the feeling that Motomi had some other purpose. Did he just like involving himself in other people's business? Or was he looking for some information? Akira and Keisuke were new here. Maybe he saw in them the potential for new leads.
正直、ちょっと心強いです。
Keisuke said with an innocent smile.
そう言ってもらえると来た甲斐があるね。
As Casey's utter lack of guile was jarring. As always, Casey's utter lack of guile was jarring. But Akira had written it off as a lost cause. Casey would never change. When are you gonna change, Akira?
とりあえず
You got a lot to work on.
さっきから警備員がおっかない目で睨んでる
What's up with all this emo bullcrap? Indeed, Akira could feel the sharp stares boring into him. At Motomi's urging, the three of them walked up to the entrance. Once inside, they were ushered down the hallway in exactly the same manner as before. Granted, this was only Akira's second time, but the decor still packed quite a punch. The sculptures of young boys, in particular, would no doubt make his skin crawl no matter how many times he saw them. When Keisuke put on one of the masks meant for new registrants, Motomi blinked at him and scratched his head, a wry smile playing about his lips.
ああ、登録者はそれつけるんだったっけな。まあ、なんつうか。
あいつ？
アルビトロ様だ。
Motomi grimaced.
趣味が悪すぎるんだよ、ここは。
Well, you still have a cigarette in your mouth, so... Even as he said it, okay, well, that time it wasn't, that was actually accurate then. Motomi was lighting a cigarette. He hissed irritably as he surveyed the interior. A guard appeared to guide the three of them onward. Midway down the main foyer, the guard had to stop to scold Motomi for kicking one of the naked boy statues. What? He's just going around kicking the boy statues? As before, the hallway ended in a set of black doors chained shut. What was behind those doors? Nothing good, Akira was certain. Keisuke stiffened slightly when the waiting room doors swung open. There were several masked men inside, the same as there had been yesterday.
そんな緊張してどうする？参加するって決めたんだろ。
His words harsh, but his tone kind. Motomi patted Keisuke on the shoulder a couple of times. Keisuke's hands were at his sides, his fingertips trembling faintly.
それじゃ。
With a strained smile, Keisuke looked first at Motomi, then at Akira. Akira met his gaze in silence. Abruptly, Keisuke turned away, as if to shake himself free of some clinging doubt, then vanished into the room. The door closed and silence descended. Now that it was too late, Akira found himself wondering if Keisuke had become a burden. Oh god, Akira, you're genuinely the biggest burden. At the same time, he knew that he had all but accepted Keisuke's choice the moment he had given up trying to dissuade him. All he could do now was produce results regardless. The sound of footsteps snapped Igura out of his thoughts. Somehow it sounds more like clapping. The master of this palace was approaching. Sensing an abrupt shift in the atmosphere, Igura peeked at Motomi's profile and saw that his forehead was deeply furrowed. He was making no effort to hide his revulsion.
おや君は昨日も来てくれた。
I never noticed how oversized his coat was. Look at that. How awful that is. Like, what? Our arbitro smiled suggestively at Igura, but turned pale the instant he spotted Motomi standing nearby.
お前、
久しぶりだな。
Clearly there was no love lost between these two.
一体何の用だ。
見回りだよ。じゃないと何するかわからんからな、お前は。
余計なお世話だ。
Igura could see the corners of Arbitro's eyes twitching behind his mask. Motomi meanwhile curled his lips into a sneer.
それにしても悪趣味ぶりは相も変わらず健在だな。ここまで来るといっそ惚れ惚れするぜ。
うるさい。お前に私の美意識を迫害する権利などない。
権利があろうとなかろうとんなことは関係ない。お前の指図は受けないさ。
Arbitro clenched his jaw tight, quivering, then slashed his arm through the air between them like a sword.
もう二度とここへは来るな。
お前が用いたマシンなりゃな。
失礼する。
Arbitro stomped off towards the waiting room. His men followed behind him. After the door had closed, Motomi exhaled deeply.
知り合いなのか。
いや、まあ、ちょっとな。
Motomi refused to meet Akira's eyes. Clearly he didn't want to give them a straight answer. His expression was difficult to read. His brows drawn together ever so slightly.
お前さんも気ぃつけた方がいいかもな。ちょいと気になってるみたいだからな。
気になってる？
処刑人に会ったんなら見たんじゃないのか、犬を。
Akira immediately recalled the boy in black bondage gear. Do you have to call it a dog?
あいつは小綺麗な顔の少年をいたぶるのが大好きなんだよ。まあ、メインは年派もいかねえようなのだから大丈夫だとは思うが、一応ね。
Oh, that's comforting. The thought made his blood go cold. He never imagined himself becoming a target in that sense. Motomi chuckled at Akira's reaction.
そういや、あの扉の向こうに何があるか知ってるか？
He jerked his chin towards the end of the corridor where the black doors stood wrapped in
い
chains.
や、
あの奥はな。
殺し屋も。
そう、闘技場だ。イルレと戦うためのな。
イルレと戦うための。
Motomi threw Akira a sideways glance, taking note of his
挑
reaction.
戦者なんざそうそういるもんじゃないからな。普段はああやって麻薬王との神聖なる決闘場を厳重に閉ざしてるってわけよ。
Suddenly, Akira's heart was racing. Behind that very door was the place Il-Ray slew his
イ
challengers.
ルレの試合があるときはここは一般開放される。イルレと挑戦者の直接対決は非公開だが、その前に余興が行われる。まあ、あの悪趣味男の演出だからたかが知れてるけどな。
From what Motomi was saying, it sounded as though Arbitra ran Igura. Akira had assumed that was Il-Ray's role.
さて、そろそろ終わるんじゃないか。
Motomi let out a brief sigh as he glanced at the waiting room door. Just then, the door opened and Arbitro emerged. Though he bade farewell to the registrants with a gracious smile, the instant he saw Motomi, his face contorted into a hysterical grimace.
まだいたのか。
登録者の付き添いだ。心配せんでもすぐに出てくさ。
I wonder how long it's going to take until we have sex. He shot Motomi a sharp glance before rushing off down the hall, his regal composure forgotten. Motomi watched him go, then he shrugged and turned to Akira. Just like last time, the registrants began leaving the room at 10-minute intervals. Keisuke was the third to come out. This time a tag hung securely around his neck.
お待たせ。
Mask in hand, Keisuke smiled a tad wearily.
待たされた待たされた。でも仮面取っちまったのか。
Keisuke looked down at the mask in his hand as if he'd only just
なん
realized.
か馴染まないし、無意識に取っちゃってた。
まあ馴染めって方が無理な話だけどな。さっきも嫌な野郎に会っちまったし。
嫌な野郎？
そう嫌な野郎だ。
そうなのか。
Blinking as though he didn't quite get it, Keisuke turned to look at Akira. You look like hell. What the hell? Why would we say that? Akira's so annoying. Not knowing how to respond, Akira looked away. Great. Shock flickered over Keisuke's face, then he looked down, biting his lip.
アキラ。まったく
Right?
気の利かんやつだな。
Right?
もっと大人になれや。
He's so annoying. Motomi, who had been watching from the sidelines, sighed and shook his
い
head.
や、いいんだ。もともとアキラは俺が参加することには反対してたし。
Keisuke smiled, obviously forced. Motomi's expression was thoughtful as he glanced between the two. 10 minutes went by before they knew it. The fourth registrant to leave the room gave Akira and the others a glare as he passed. I thought he was supposed to, like,
退散
leave
しとくかね。
before the other registrants came out. Have we been standing here for 10 minutes? Have we just been standing here for 10 minutes in silence? They followed Motomi back to the entrance, where they handed Keisuke a mask to a guard, then left the palace. Keisuke paused, his chest swelling as he drank his fill of the chilly air. Though his face was still shadowed by worry, Akira thought it also held a new confidence. It was the face of a man who was set on his course.
シャバの空気はうまいか。
Motomi spoke jokingly, raising his eyebrows. Keisuke smiled awkwardly and lowered his eyes a bit.
どうかな。
They stood there a little while longer, looking out at the slice of Toshima visible from the palace. Suddenly, Motomi started patting his pockets.
なんだよ。
タバコが切れやがって。
Motomi hissed and scratched his hair irritably while heading down the stairs. Akira and Keisuke followed behind him. When he reached the bottom, Motomi turned back.
さーて、おいちゃんは用事があるからな。ここでバイバイだ。タバコも買わんといかんからな。
ありがとうございました。
Keisuke's polite bow drew a deep laugh from the older man.
ねえ、なんかいらないって。何もしてないからな。それより、こっからが大変だぞ。
Keisuke accepted Motomi's warning with a solemn nod.
そんじゃあまあ、またな。
Motomi raised a hand in farewell, then ambled off down the road. After he'd vanished from sight, Akira turned to Keisuke.
タグ見せてくれ。
ああ、うん。
Keisuke pulled 4 tags from his coverall pockets.
首に下げてるやつがスペードのエース。あとは使えないやつが4枚。7、3、5、8かな。
エースか。
有効な札が1枚しかない。
いや、十分だろ。
On the whole, one probably had a greater chance of not receiving any significant tags. After stashing the bundle safely in his pocket, Keisuke stretched and looked up at the sky.
イグラか。
As though drawn in by Keisuke's murmur, Akira looked up as well. The murky boundary between the sky and the clouds seemed to reflect his feelings perfectly. Does it really? Does it really, or are you just saying stupid emo shit? There was no turning back now. Neither he nor Keisuke could leave Toshima until he defeated Ill Ray. I mean, you could leave. We're not going to chase you out of Igura. You could just leave, so I don't know why they're saying that. There's literally nothing keeping you here. Something was wrong. Shortly after leaving the palace behind, Akira stopped and looked over his shoulder.
どうした？
いや、
Since parting ways with Motomi, Akira had felt like he was being watched. But perhaps it was only his mind playing tricks on him. He scanned the shadows and what he could see of nearby alleyways, but couldn't pick out anything resembling a human shape. When he'd first arrived in Toshima, he felt as if people were lurking in every nook and cranny. But little by little, he was learning to distinguish empty alleys from those that had hid potential threats. Still, he could never be sure.
疲れてるんじゃないのか？ちゃんと寝た？昨日。
Akira was a light sleeper. Most nights he spent drifting along the border between sleep and wakefulness. Perhaps he had worn himself out without realizing it. One's body and spirit rarely function in perfect sync. For the moment, he could only press forward. His mind had been playing tricks on him. For a split second, a different noise interrupted the sound of their footsteps. When he turned to see what was behind him, Keisuke suddenly vanished from sight. What? Akira turned. There he was in the inky shadows that filled a gap between two buildings. Somebody was holding his arms behind his back. God, somehow I remember this guy from the anime. Ugh. Ugh. The first thing Akira saw was blue hair, then a garish yellow scarf and a flashy shirt. Finally, he noticed the man's skin-tight motorcycle jacket and eye patch. At first glance, despite his exotic appearance, he looked like any other wayward youth. But his eyes shone like those of a starving wolf, and a silver tag hung on his chest. Akira struggled to pry the arm from his neck, and the man drew his blade and pressed it to his cheek. The blade was shaped like a machete and looked large enough to split Keisuke's skull with ease.
あんまり暴れんなよ。怪我するぜ。
The man spoke in a hoarse, breathy voice, almost a whisper without taking his eyes off Akira.
もうほらいっと。
There was a dull metallic sound as he ripped the tag away from Keisuke's neck. As far as Akira understood it, Igura duels were meant to be fair. An ambush like this had been against the rules. Akira thought it strange at first that such rules could function in a city like this. That was until he'd witnessed the brutality of the men charged with punishing offenders.
処刑人が喜んで飛びつきそうなやり方だな。
関係ねえな。あいつらは違反者だろうとそうじゃなかろうと殺したいと思った時に殺すんだよ。だったらルールを守る必要なんてねえじゃねえか。
He snorted derisively and glanced at the tag he'd taken. This seemed to end fast, and before the executioner showed up, the last thing Akira wanted was to risk another encounter with those two, especially now that the dog had the scent of his tags. Akira chucked his bag aside and reached for the knife at his waist. Just as his hand closed around the hilt, the man let out a yelp. His face twisted in pain. Keisuke had bitten down on the arm, throttling his neck. Eyes dark with anger, the man held Keisuke fast.
この野郎、死ね！
The man raised his knife for the killing blow. That was when Akira charged him. I mean, it wasn't really smart to go 2-on-1, was it? Akira caught the man with a full body tackle, dragging him to the ground with his knife still high above his head. Like, how does this guy see two people walking around and thinks that's easy prey? Like, what?
Akira! てめえ、この野郎!
Akira straddled the man and attempted to pin his arms down, but his enemy was putting up a fight. Their arms shook with the strain of their struggle, sparks flying between their locked eyes. The man howled, kneeing Akira in the stomach. Akira let the blow push him to his feet, then leapt back and drew his blade. The man rose slowly, smirking when he saw what Akira was holding.
そう来なくっちゃな。
Wrapping the chain of his stolen tag around his wrist, he beckoned to Akira with the tip of his knife. Akira studied the man silently. His moves were crude, but he clearly matched Akira in strength.
おいおい、固まっちまったのか？だったら、こっちから行かせてもらうぜ！
The man dropped his hips and charged. Jesus, why does Akira look like that? It looks like he's seen a effing ghost. Look at him. That's not normal. That's not natural. He's fucking possessed. A gust of wind howled past Akira's ear. the weight of the enemy's blade and the bloodlust whipping the air into a frenzy. Even though Akira dodged the strike, its passage left his cheeks stinging. Before the man could recover from his missed attack, Akira thrust upward at his stomach. The man was more agile than he looked. He pulled back swiftly, then lunged forward with another swing of his blade. It was tough to calculate the right timing. Although the enemy's weapon was long and his attacks bold, he was also quick to recover and left no opening large enough for Akira to exploit. Panting breath, clashing blades, their feet beat out in a regular rhythm. The street was silent, but for the sounds of their struggle. With a shout, the man took a long step forward and delivered a horizontal slash. Their blades met with bone-jarring force. Akira felt his fingers go numb, but he managed to kill his opponent's momentum. The two men were close enough to feel each other's breath. Beyond the crossed blades, Akira saw a fearless smile play on the enemy's lips. Unlike Akira, whose natural talent for exploiting his enemy's vulnerabilities made his movements smooth and precise, the other man's attacks were crude and unrefined. At the same time, however, he clearly knew how to use his raw strength to the fullest. A silver cross hung next to his tag, reflecting a dull light. The man roared, pushing Akira back. The cross had distracted him, and his response was slowed. What are you paying attention to in this fight? The enemy struck for the kill. The blade approached, filling his sight. Maybe you should be quiet now, Keisuke. He's trying to fight. Just before it could reach him, Akira extended his right hand and slashed at the man's chest. Something had caught at the tip of his knife. The man froze, his eyes opened wide. Akira's blade hadn't touched his flesh. Instead, it had snagged on the man's tag and cross, snapping their chains in the blink of an eye. The links filled the air with a sound like falling glass, transforming into silver crystals as they scattered. All three men in the scene stood petrified. As one, their eyes went to where the tag lay fallen beside the cross. The cross was plain, the size of a chilled child's palm, its surface scratched and worn. The man seemed dazed. He hardly noticed when Akira cut Keisuke's tag free from his waist. Little by little, however, his gaze shifted from the cross back to Akira, and his face contorted with rage. Is he a Christian murderer? Good for him. Raw hate burned in his eyes. Akira struggled not to flinch back in terror. Was he only now reacting to the loss of the stolen tag? But the man had made no move to resume the fight. Instead, his knife sagged as he lowered his hand, his lips still tight with anger. He knelt to retrieve his cross from the ground. He raised it slowly to his face and stared at it intently. Right now, in the middle of the fight, for an instant, a shadow of sadness seemed to flicker in his eyes. Then he closed his fist. At that exact moment, the man thought, what would Jesus do? Then he closed his fist around the cross and bowed his head, a pious gesture as if sending up a prayer. Akira could hardly believe that this was the same man who had been trying to kill him a moment ago. The next time the man opened his eyes, he abruptly slashed at Akira with all his strength. Once again, Akira managed to stop the attack with his own knife. The screech of metal filled the air. With a frustrated shout, the man jumped back. After giving Akira a long glare, he spun and took off running. Akira watched him vanish down the street. He felt deflated like a victim of a joke. Why had the man abandoned the fight? There was no question he'd wanted Akira dead. But no, it hardly mattered. This hadn't been a legitimate fight to begin with. Whatever happened was no fault of Akira's. As Akira turned back to Casey, a flash of metal on the ground caught his eye. Okay guys, I'm gonna end this episode here right after we ran into the Christian Igura fighter who had a suddenly remembered Jesus existed and he couldn't fight us anymore. So I'm gonna go ahead and end this video here. As I said, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye bye.